Hello, my name's Deborah Pout. I'm from the Oxford Media Network, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Oxford Media Network and Lord Lothian on behalf of Global Strategy Forum. Welcome to Broadcast Battleground, how the mainstream media and social media shape military decision-making. And we've got a fantastic panel to discuss this issue. We have General Sir Nick Carter, the former Chief of the Defence Staff until 2021. We've got Manveen Rana, the award-winning investigative journalist and host of Our Stories on Times Radio, and Peter Apps, who is Global Affairs columnist at Reuters and an Army reservist, so incredibly well qualified to chair this session. I'm going to hand over now to Peter to introduce further our speakers. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and huge thanks to the National Liberal Club, Oxford Media Network and Global Strategy Forum for convening what I'm hoping should be a fantastic discussion. And particularly Debbie, I think it's relatively rare one hears the phrase Army reservist and incredibly well qualified back to back in the same sentence, particularly in such august surroundings. So yeah, as Debbie says, I am my day job has been as a Reuters journalist and then a Reuters columnist. So I have sat at the sort of intersection of things that go bang and things that make news and things that appear on the internet for pretty much my entire professional life. Starting from at the age of at the age of 9 during the first Gulf War, writing a newspaper with biro for taking reports off BBC World Service, through to being a young officer cadet in the early 2000s when then Colonel Sir Nick was a legend in leading his battalion in Kosovo during a particularly sort of complex period, and then first as a reporter and then back in the Army Reserve during the 2010s. Not a lot of people in many armies who look like me. So for those who don't know, I broke my neck covering the Sri Lankan Civil War about 17 years ago, and one of the reasons that I was able to get back into the British Army 7 years ago is because of some of the changes that General Sir Nick put in place that he may well talk about in his address. Both our panellists are much better qualified than me. Obviously, General Sir Nick needs barely any introduction. I'm going to do my best. Chief of the Defence Staff, formerly Chief of the General Staff, stood down last year, and the world has more or less fallen apart since he stood down as CDS. Manveen, obviously, podcaster, now award-winning investigative journalist before. My sort of 2 cents on this before they start. One of the things that I was really struck by when I was a correspondent on the ground is that, particularly when things are going bang in a globally important way, so your Ukraines, Sri Lanka when the war's breaking out, Kosovo's, any of those moments that we all remember that people write about sort of decades later, you get a very, very fast feedback loop between what could be tactical decision-making on the ground, sort of, Pristina Airport's probably a really good example, where the Russians grabbed Pristina Airport in 1999, and what appears in sort of global news. And then what appears on every TV show on the planet will then have a very fast tactical effect on what happens on the ground. That has got faster and faster and more complicated throughout my entire career. When I started, the internet was barely a sort of barely a thing in sort of the 99, 2000. It has grown, and as it has grown, the complexity of this has metastasized in a large number of ways. We talk a lot about disinformation. That's clearly true. You can see the Russians and a bunch of other people working in this space, but on almost every level, things are a lot more complicated and a lot less curated than they were when any of us would have started our careers. People see very different universes now. You can pick what you see on social media, and then there are those moments, COVID, which obviously General Sir Nick was CDS, Ukraine being very obvious examples last year, where suddenly everyone is on the same page again, looking at the same thing, albeit sometimes from very different angles. And hopefully those are some of the issues that we can look into. We can talk about media, we can talk about information operations. You can submit your questions online. With that, General Sir Nick, I'm going to let you make your contribution.
No, Peter, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to be with you this afternoon in these august surroundings. What I'm going to do, actually, is I'm going to, in due course, I think, challenge the premise of the title, because, of course, the premise of the title is that the media shapes the military. Actually, I'm going to say that the military has learned quite a lot from the last 20 years, and actually the military arguably tries to shape the media as well. Anyway, you can take your own view as I take myself through what I'm going to say. My starting point, though, is that during my career, the character of politics and warfare have evolved markedly. And that's principally because of the ever-increasing pace of technological change, and with it, the pervasiveness of information. And the fact that information now is very much democratized, I would suggest. And of course, what this has also done is to blur the distinctions between peace and war, between virtual and reality, between state and non-state, and between foreign and domestic policy. But let's cast our minds back some 40 years to the Falklands War of 1982. And many of you will remember Ian MacDonald, the government spokesman who filled our screens back in the day, when of course we all used to watch the 9 o'clock news on the BBC. And he spoke at dictation speed and in a tone that the audience found authentic and reassuring. Oh, for those days again. But few people, I suspect, realised the extent to which his message was actually being censored and carefully timed. Many of you, I think, will also remember Brian Hanrahan's report on a mission by the Sea Harriers, in which he told us, I quote, "I've counted them all out and I've counted them all back." What we tend to forget is that the whole quote started with him saying, "I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid." This, I think, was arguably the last war in which the military was able genuinely to censor the message. Embedded reporters like Max Hastings and Robert Fox, who's in the audience, Robert, lovely to see you, and Michael Nicholson, had to use the military satellite system to file their reports. It took 12 hours, for example, for the details of the sinking of HMS Coventry to emerge in the UK. All news was vetted and operational security was absolutely the priority. Compare that to today, when embedded journalists have their own means of communication, and frankly, anyone on the battlefield can be a journalist if they want to be, and upload their information and anything they want to a global audience. This is what I think I would call is the phenomenon of combat in a fishbowl. Combat in a fishbowl. And the military has had to find a way of operating in this fishbowl. The military has also had to recognise that victory in this fishbowl is invariably more about the triumph of the narrative, not necessarily physical activity on that battlefield. In a book that I would commend to you, published in 2017, called War in 140 Characters, How Social Media is Reshaping Conflict in the 21st Century, David Patrikarakos observes of the war in Ukraine, "I was caught up in two wars. One fought on the ground with tanks and artillery, and an information war fought largely, though not exclusively, through social media. And counterintuitively, it mattered more who won the war of words and narratives than who had the most potent weaponry." And of course, we see that playing out vividly in the current war, where both sides are using propaganda to shape opinion most effectively. And of course, both sides are very aware of the risks of allowing information to leak out that might compromise operational security. Consider how careful Ukraine is being about guarding real casualty rates. And of course, what we've also seen is the way in which classified information can be put out there. Back in November of 2021, before the war started, the United States and the UK took the view that it was worth revealing to the world, and particularly to our NATO allies, that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And that was an attempt to undermine Mr. Putin's plans. Now, I'm going to use some of my own experience to try and bring this to life, so you can understand the journey that I've been on and the British Army has been on over the last 15 years. And I'm going to look at southern Afghanistan. Now, I want you to cast your minds back to 2009, when we were experiencing extraordinarily high casualty rates. You will recall the Wootton Bassett piece and body bags coming back on a ghastly regular basis. We'd had a succession of unsuccessful operations, which were very heavy in blood and treasure. Gordon Brown had just become Prime Minister and was hugely nervous about the political impact of this campaign, and President Obama had just taken over as President. And of course, what happened towards the end of 2009 was that President Obama decided significantly to reinforce the campaign in Afghanistan. And most of those reinforcements came to southern Afghanistan to begin with and were placed under my command as the commander of Regional Command South in Kandahar and Helmand and some adjacent provinces. Now, what of course came with that uplift in numbers was a new general, a man called Stan McChrystal, who subsequently fell foul of the media, and you will recall that. But nonetheless, General McChrystal's view was that we need a different approach to how we're going to deal with the campaign in Afghanistan, an approach that was going to be focused on the population and was going to be about partnering with the Afghan security forces to achieve the outcomes that we wanted. Now, for him, this reinforcement therefore presented a significant opportunity. And that opportunity fell in my lap down in southern Afghanistan. And under the title of Operation Mushtarak, which in Dari and Pashto means together, to my point about doing this with the Afghans, we launched over a course of the months of February the largest operation certainly in aviation terms, but arguably in human being terms, since probably Gulf War I. And that operation was very much focused on trying to connect the population in southern Afghanistan to good governance. It was much less about killing people. It was much more about making that connection and creating the conditions for the population in Helmand to begin with, and subsequently in Kandahar, to feel that they were being governed. Now, you will appreciate that in trying to achieve this effect, multiple audiences were relevant to the attainment of that objective. Whether that was, on the one hand, the Afghan population itself, whether it was the Afghan security forces who were going to be our partners in all of this, whether it was going to be the government of Afghanistan, led by President Karzai, whether it was going to be the leadership of the Afghan security forces, my US chain of command were relevant as far as I was concerned, NATO allies and NATO capitals, and of course the people that I commanded, like the US Marine Corps and the US Army. Now, all of these audiences had a stake in the outcome, and all of these audiences needed in one way or the other to be managed and to be shaped for this operation to be positive. And I'll give you a stark example of the challenge. What was vital to us was that we had enough Afghan partners. And that meant that the Afghan army battalions that we had in the region needed to be taken from some provinces and brought to Helmand for this operation. It meant that, for example, the battalion that the Australians had been training in partnership with the Dutch in the province to the north of Kandahar needed to be redeployed to Helmand for a period of 3 or 4 months in order to be able to see this task through. Well, you can imagine my amusement when about a month before this operation was landed, the Australian ambassador appeared in my office in Kandahar and placed a démarche on my desk, making the point that this battalion could not be moved to Helmand because the Australians had invested a great deal of effort in it, and of course it was their path to exiting the campaign. He was then very frustrated when I handed him a letter written in Dari and signed by President Karzai, which showed that the movement of that battalion from Uruzgan to Helmand was an order given by the Afghan president. And I observed to the Australian ambassador, the Afghans are now in charge of this. Please go and put the démarche on President Karzai's desk. And that, of course, was an example of how some of these people have to be shaped in order to make this happen. And I knew I was going to get a démarche, which was why I made certain that we had a letter down the Afghan chain of command to make the point that this was what was happening. But of course it's wider than that. What one also needed to do was to get the message into capitals. And for example, to get Number 10 to realise that this operation wasn't going to be a waste of blood and treasure like the previous ones. It would be one that would stick and which would change the whole balance in southern Afghanistan. Now, I also knew that for Mushtarak, I would probably have around 70 embedded journalists from the UK, probably from Australia, but also particularly from the United States. And they would be embedded in Task Force Helmand and with the US Marine Corps. Now, I remembered from when I had watched the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I remembered the huge number of embeds there were in all of the units on the ground in that particular campaign. And what really struck me was there was no journalist at any level who was able to bring the whole big picture together. Because what was happening was you were getting all these very tactical reports popping up, which sometimes were really quite serious and made one look like the whole thing was going to hell in a handcart. So the deduction I drew from this was there would be merit in getting an American and a British anchor person into our operations centre in Kandahar. And indeed, Frank Gardner helpfully became available, although the civil service did everything they possibly could to try and make sure that we couldn't bring him out there because of duty of care. But ultimately, he came out to act as the anchor person in the operations room. And the great advantage we had, therefore, was that these two journalists with access to the whole plan and the big picture, were able to explain the bigger picture in a way that the embeds were then put properly into context. And this, of course, meant that getting the narrative into people's front rooms in the UK and in the United States was done quite successfully. This approach was also used subsequently by General David Petraeus, who took over from McChrystal in 2010. And he realised pretty early on in his tenure that one of the things we lacked was quantities of NATO trainers we needed to train the Afghan security forces at scale to be able to take the operation off us as a coalition. So he thought about it, and he realised that in the November of that year, the NATO North Atlantic Council was coming out to do a formal visit to his command in Afghanistan. So what he did in a very deliberate way was he invited, over the course of June and July and August, a number of journalists from European capitals to come out and begin to write articles about the need for trainers. And what he was attempting to do, and did very successfully, was to land subliminally in the minds of the NATO Atlantic Council that this was an issue. So that when they subsequently came out, he found that he had more support than he might have imagined for that reinforcement that was required. Now, all of this meant there were some quite important lessons which I drew out of what had happened in Afghanistan. And when I subsequently was tasked with Army 2020, which was the task of modernising the army in 2011, I decided there were a couple of things that needed to be included in relation to information warfare. The first of these was that I felt our doctrine needed updating. And we military like having a doctrine and a concept at the front end of everything, because it provides the intellectual rationale for all the structures that flow from it. And the doctrine that we espoused was something called integrated action. And what this now requires a commander to do on a battlefield is, first of all, to analyse the outcome that he or she is trying to achieve, then to work out all of the audiences that are relevant to the attainment of that outcome, not just the enemy, then to work out what effect you want to impart on the enemy, and then to look into your locker of methodologies, from soft through to hard power, to work out what is the best mix of methodologies to impart effect onto audience to achieve the outcome. And that is a very systematic way of thinking through the problem in this new information environment we find ourselves in. What I then realised was that in the British Army we didn't have a tool to be able to make this doctrine happen in the way that I wanted it to happen. And as a result of that, I found, as the head of the army, that I would create something called 77 Brigade. And 77 Brigade was essentially, when I took over as the head of the army, a military stabilisation brigade or formation, which had embedded media advisors in it, but it was essentially about military stabilisation, so engineering support, the Engineer Logistics Staff Corps, and various other capabilities that had been really important during the Balkans campaigns were still important, but the emphasis was much more on stabilisation than on media. So what we did was to create something that was very much focused in terms of its mission on changing or maintaining behaviour using non-violent means. And what we wanted to do was to be very innovative in the way that we do this and to apply the indirect approach to it. And as a consequence, this formation began to be tasked with manoeuvre in social media and in media more widely. Didn't get rid of the media advisors, they're still vital to look after the media that might visit units on battlefields. But this was about working out how the narrative and the message could land in the modern information environment. We created a connection to the Chindits, and many of you, I'm sure, in walking down the embankment will have seen the Chindit monument outside the Ministry of Defence. And the idea behind that was because we wanted to have a spirit of slight maverick about the way we were going to do this, but particularly to get after the innovation. We also recognised that in doing this, that we probably weren't going to be able to recruit the sorts of capabilities we needed to be able to manoeuvre in social media and to a degree cyberspace simply by looking into the regular army. And we realised that if we were going to do it more widely, we would have to use our reservist network to achieve the effect. And at the very beginning, we targeted, for example, a BBC production team, the country's leading expert in terms of Arabic poetry, and various other people who we encouraged to become reservists in order to give us the capabilities that we needed. We also recognised in doing this that some of the physical attributes that were necessary, perhaps to join the regular army or indeed the full reserve, were probably unnecessary if you wanted experts who could manoeuvre in social media and in the cyber domain. So we ripped up the book according to physical aptitude, and we accepted people because of their skill set and the value they could add through being on board. And that changed the Manning model, as Peter was referring to when he introduced this. And of course, what 77 Brigade is now doing is providing vital support on the battlefield in Ukraine, obviously from the UK, not on the ground. Now, I think that we've also seen, and it's important to make this point, the 77 Brigade was designed for operations on the battlefield. It is not designed for a government to use at the strategic level, because we're not going to get into political propaganda and everything associated with that. Now, all of this has, in terms of this context, a significant impact, I think, on military leadership. Because I would also argue that leadership clearly requires communication. And today, for leaders in the military, this is as much about your real-life presence and personality as it is about social media. Communication, which was once the sole preserve of words and voice, is now obviously moving to video and to images in a very different way. It is striking if you think that Shakespeare had a vocabulary of some 24,000 words. James Joyce had a vocabulary of around 12,000 words. The average Oxford graduate, graduating in the last 10 years, would have had a vocabulary of around 6,000 words. The average American student now has a vocabulary of around 850 words. And that is clearly related to the way in which they move information around. And we need to understand that as leaders. Now, some of the facts are revealing, I think, about information now. If you think it took radio some 38 years to reach 50 million people, it took TV 13 years to reach 50 million people, it took the internet 4 years to do the same, and of course Facebook added over 200 million in its first year. And I'm sure you all know this, but just to bang the nail firmly out of sight, if Facebook was a country, it would be larger than the combined populations of India and China put together. So jolly nearly 40% of the world's population. 24 out of 25 of the world's largest newspapers are experiencing record declines in non-internet-based circulation. And of course, we're now in a world where podcasts matter. We no longer search for news, news searches for us. And invariably, it'll find us on social media. And as Eric Qualman, a noted commentator on this, put it a while ago, we don't have a choice on whether we do social media. The question is how well we do it. Now, I've drawn some deductions from this, which I think are relevant to our leaders and the way they communicate. First and foremost, I would suggest that ideas are worthless unless they're delivered through the right media to the relevant audience. Hence, the ability to communicate and tell the story is an essential quality of modern leadership. We no longer have any secrets. There's nowhere to hide. So one's value and credibility as a leader have never been more important. Perhaps that resonates in what's happening in the Houses of Parliament this afternoon. There is ultimately no substitute for transparency and for honesty. As Bill Clinton was advised, tell it early, tell it all, and tell it yourself. The media environment is characterised by anarchy, and it requires, I would suggest, a different approach to leadership. And that's why, in a sense, our military doctrine is quite helpful to us, because we believe in decentralising and delegating. We believe that our commanders at low levels have to be comfortable with anarchy. And of course, we also need to recognise that there are some really challenging ethical dimensions to this democratisation of information. You'll all remember, I'm sure, the Sergeant Blackman affair, when he was accused of killing a member of the Taliban in cold blood. And of course, you're all familiar with the coming generation's particular predilection with uploading everything they do on social media. This is a real challenge for military leadership, because on the whole, we are always striving to retain the moral high ground on the battlefields on which we lead. Now, journalists have a role to play, I think, in holding us to account. It's pretty difficult as an embed because, of course, you become very close to the units that you're embedded with. And I believe it is right for journalists to call us out if we behave badly, assuming that they conduct due diligence, as Piers Morgan failed to do, you recall, at the beginning of the Iraq War. But ultimately, we depend on retaining the moral high ground. So, pulling that together, I'm going to ask you in conclusion, in the light of what I have explained, do you agree with the title of this discussion? Does the media shape military decision-making, or does winning on modern battlefields require the military to shape the media to ensure it wins the battle of the narratives? Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir. Manveen, you're up.
Right. Thanks, Nick. Turns out not only did he run the military, he's also a very good speaker. Rather hard act to follow, but I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to share a few thoughts from my own experiences of that intersection between the media and the military. And this discussion couldn't be more timely. As Nick says, the media and social media landscape has just transformed over the last decade, really. We are living through a moment of extraordinary change, and none of us, media or military, really know where it's going to end. In Ukraine right now, we're watching the first TikTok war unfold. And last summer, that meant the Russians, who've always put messaging and the information war at the heart of their military operations. At one point, they brought a propaganda guy in to sort of take photographs and put up a social media presence for the Wagner group and make them look cuddly. And he accidentally ended up putting up pictures on social media explaining with road signs showing exactly where their headquarters were, which led to the most successful attack the Ukrainian army had launched in a while, where they took out the whole of the headquarters. That, again, is a new innovation. Nobody had really thought about how it would play out on social media before. TikTok itself has become a huge tool for the Wagner group. There are a terrifying number of videos uploaded at the moment that anybody all over the world, regardless of age really, can watch, showing Wagner mercenaries killing Ukrainian soldiers in trenches. Horrendous, uncensored images that are out there, and even more alarmingly, have been viewed tens of billions of times. There is a weird appetite for images like this. They are an incredibly effective propaganda tool, it turns out. We can only hope, though, that whilst they are going around the world and they are spreading the message that what Wagner Group wants out, that hopefully some of those billions of viewings are being done by the International Criminal Court, because we have, for the first time, live evidence of war crimes being committed. Presumably, this will come back to hurt, and this certainly wasn't the intention. But this is, again, the TikTok world that none of us are really used to. As Nick described it as the goldfish bowl, it's never been more intense, and I think we're all at the moment trying to catch up with the pace at which it's moving. This discussion in particular today, the title is about how the media and social media shape military thinking, even though Nick obviously disputes that. It's very hard for me to talk about military thinking. Sadly, they don't consult journalists anywhere near enough, more's the pity. But from my own career, I've been a foreign correspondent in bits of the Middle East. I was there during the Arab Spring. I was there during the Syrian war, where we began to see the information war changing overnight. We started to see how social media was able to shape political movements. We started to see how disinformation was spreading in a way that it never had before. So I've seen sort of a lot of this change on my watch, effectively. I've also been an investigative journalist, and amongst my investigations, I've looked a lot at Russian disinformation campaigns, but also one of my investigations brought down a company called Bell Pottinger, who are an older example of how governments use messaging in order to disinformation, in order to spread their message through slightly unscrupulous means. So I've sort of seen all of this at the coalface. And I think the first part of the title today really highlights its urgency, because the biggest broadcast battleground at the moment, which we're all caught up in, and Ukraine is really just the pointed edge of it, is the battle between liberal democracies and the values we cherish and autocracies. And the first casualty of any war is always the truth. And for us, that's the biggest battle now, working out how we protect the truth, how we get the correct message across without having to undermine our own values, without having to resort to lies or disinformation ourselves. And I think that's a real battle which presumably people like the 77 Brigade Nick's set up are facing every day, but so are journalists. For many of us who covered Syria, a lot of this we became very alert to the problem, covering the rise of ISIS. Because for the first time, you had an opposition who were far better, far savvier at messaging than anything we'd ever seen coming out of Western governments. You had a group of people who knew how to put up beautifully produced, with very high production values, videos. They had a glossy magazine, they had memes, they had a social media presence that made young people laugh, that got them engaged in a way that we didn't seem to know how to counter. So whilst bombs, American and British bombs took out the caliphate territorially later, in terms of how you reached the people that they'd actually spread their message to, we still don't know if they're all gone or if it's dormant. That was much harder, and at the time, the response, and I'm sure 77 Brigade is much savvier at this stuff now, but at the time, the response was pretty clumsy. There was a coordinated, anti-ISIS group coming out of America who had just put out fact sheets effectively. It was like the dad dancing version of messaging, where it was awkward and nobody under the age of 40 was going to be impressed by it. And I think that's been a problem for journalists too. A friend of mine at the New York Times once said the problem with trying to call out the truth during the Trump era was we kept putting out fact-checking missions, but you were basically taking a pen to a knife fight. And it just, you can present truths, but that doesn't hold as much sway as an attractive lie. ISIS was a very obvious example of this, but none of this is new. Nick, as Chief of the Defence Staff, often talked about the grey zone and about how war was being conducted under the level of, actually being on the battlefield on a constant basis. And this is something the Russians have been expert in for a very long time, particularly using disinformation to wage political war, active measures as they used to call it. We saw this. It goes all the way back to the Stalinist era, but we saw it very clearly in the 80s, for example. At the time, they launched something called Operation Infection, which was very cunning and highlights exactly how they operate, where they put out disinformation. The Stasi and the KGB had these operations going where they put out disinformation claiming America had created HIV/AIDS as a biochemical weapon, and they were now unleashing it on the world. And this went all over Latin America, it went all over Africa. They then produced almost convincing Pentagon documents which showed that America was actually carrying out more of these experiments on HIV in Pakistan with the aim of unleashing it over the border and into India. And there were suddenly screaming headlines across the subcontinent saying AIDS invasion coming to India, thanks to the Pentagon. And it was incredibly effective because you can try and counter that with truth, but what they'd managed to do was go over the level of government and reach the population directly, sow the seeds of distrust so that they questioned Americans, they were suspicious of Western influence, but also they questioned their own politicians if they denied it. And that's how they really succeed in undermining our democratic systems. And we've seen it here. We've seen troll farms and interference in elections. We've also seen over the last few years a preponderance of conspiracy theories that the Russians are releasing in order to undermine our democratic systems. A couple of years ago, at the height of the COVID pandemic, I did an investigation for the Times where I'd managed to catch a disinformation campaign just as it was launching, where the Russians were telling the world, and they were focusing on the same areas, so Latin America, Asia, Africa, and they were telling them that the AstraZeneca vaccine was the monkey vaccine, and chances were if you took it, you might turn into an ape. Ridiculous, obviously ridiculous, but actually very effective at sowing a seed of distrust, particularly in a culture where there's already lots of anti-vax conspiracies. There's just yet another reason for people to be suspicious. Not only did it would it have made people more suspicious, but it was very cunning because it would have meant in a lot of those countries, they were trying to get the vaccine contract that would have been worth billions to Russia if they'd become the main provider of vaccine in these countries. But also all of these countries in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, would have been reliant on Russia in terms of their COVID strategy, in terms of reopening up to the world, which is an inordinate amount of power you can have without ever having to go to the trouble of going to war We were very lucky with that. We managed to call it out just as the campaign was starting, and the Kremlin ended up facing questions from around the world and having to withdraw the campaign, luckily. Normally, you're left trying to fight those conspiracy theories when they're already out, and that's much harder because conspiracies cling on, and they're much harder to get rid of. We saw a lot of this with Russian tactics in Syria. So we ended up sort of seeing them the playbook in action, where quite often, whenever they were about to attack a rebel-held area with horrendous weapons, with either cluster bombs or even chemical weapons, they would put out reports. They would start dotting them out for a few days beforehand, claiming that the West, often America, through its proxies, the rebels it was sort of funding, were about to attack themselves with chemical weapons in order to show the world they'd crossed red lines, or they're about to attack themselves with cluster bombs to make Russia and Assad look bad. I mean, it's absurd and yet weirdly effective. You suddenly had the world dividing between people who thought there were horrendous atrocities being carried out against these rebels, and the others who sort of thought they were doing them themselves. And it's incredibly hard to shift an idea like that once it's landed. But as good as the Russians have been at sowing these seeds of discord and at this playbook of false flag operations, they seem to have come a cropper in Ukraine, partly because I think Syria was so recent and so many Western journalists were aware of how they worked and were able to sort of call it out as it was happening, and people have become more savvy about spotting it. But also, I think in the world of strategic communications, nobody had quite seen Ukraine coming as the great power who'd sort of understood messaging better than any of us could have expected. They've been incredibly successful online, on Twitter, in having these great ambassadors who are out doing media across the world. They seem to be very effective in Europe. I think we can sort of assume most of the population here seem to be very supportive. Less successful elsewhere, though. You know, again, I've talked a number of times about those sort of networks in places like Latin America, Africa, Asia, that Russia has been sowing for years. You know, RT has a massive presence in each of these countries. So it's no surprise that you suddenly have South Africa carrying out exercises with Russia at the moment. You know, Ukraine hasn't really sort of won the war of propaganda when it comes to the global south, and I don't think it's really focusing on it. It's also been weirdly unsuccessful, or less successful than you'd assume, in America. And that's because it seems to have come up against domestic politics. And this, again, is something Nick probably understands more than most, but so much of being able to carry out a successful military operation and messaging comes down to that coordinating with politics, or being able to knowing how to influence it. And I find it baffling that you now have the Republicans saying they would withdraw support, or they would certainly minimize it, when this is a party that is obviously jaded by war, doesn't really want to go to war itself, was also shaped quite a lot of the politicians during the Cold War, and here they are being given the opportunity of a war that costs no American lives, and is basically cheap at twice the price. They could potentially take Russia out for a generation without having ceded a single American life, and yet they're very anti. Clearly, Ukraine hasn't quite figured out the lobbying as well as it has the messaging. All of these things are incredibly important, these campaigns at the moment, because of the war for the truth, the war against propaganda. But in order to protect liberal democracy, one final thought is just, I think we probably need to start at home. Nick has talked very, very impressively about the things he did when he was in charge of the army and of the military in trying to make sure that they were communicating with the public and trying to shape the narrative. As a journalist on the other end of that, I would say it isn't always easy getting answers out of the military here, or getting a sense of transparency on what's happening. And I suspect some of that is because whatever the army are doing, it all hits a funnel neck when it gets to the MOD, when it gets to civil servants. But I think that is a huge problem for us. We fund the military. We need to be able to benefit from its expertise too, and be able to question it when needed, and that's not very easy here. I remember during the Iraq War going to the Pentagon, and they had an entire corridor where journalists were sat the whole time. Whenever something came up, they would run down the corridor and they would get an expert military voice to tell them exactly what was happening. That's how important America thought the message was. I'm not stupid enough to assume they told them everything, but it was very savvy because it at least made it look transparent. Here, you can call the MOD and you won't hear back for 3 days if you do at all. It's incredibly frustrating, and I think the danger of it is that it does mean people like Nick in his last job, and he won't thank me for saying this, which is why I'll say it, wouldn't be allowed to do interviews until they were given the political go-ahead, which does mean you end up with a system where the military are wheeled out at will when a politician usually needs to cover themselves. And I think that's incredibly hard because you do risk politicizing the military, which in a liberal democracy, I think, is problematic. But perhaps he'll talk about that later. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well done.
So, thank you both. I mean, a lot of brain freeze. I'm struck by Manveen's last comment. Correspondents in the Pentagon have an office in the Pentagon and a security pass, and they can wander the corridors relatively freely in most of the building. And they can wander into somewhere like the US Navy kind of PAO's office, and they'll very excitedly show you the map where all the carriers are. That is not necessarily the experience of operating within the MOD. But I want to kind of take kind of a question to both of you about sort of strategic decision making, either as a policymaker in government or as a journalist. I mean, I think we understand the Russian model pretty well. It's it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. They'll push it. They'll push a very high volume. There's clearly a sort of race to the bottom. From the sort of day-to-day media, the sort of the Reuterses and the BBC News 24s, you're feeding a daily news churn. Whereas for both of you, yourself, General, on the government side, and for yourself as a kind of reporter picking what to look at, how do you cut through that noise and pick out what the important things to do and not to do are, and what are the pressures like? Obviously, on the government side, one of the things that I've noticed in both sides, there is no such one thing as the British government. You've got 3 services, you've got MOD, you've got multiple other sort of agencies and entities. Likewise, as a journalist, there are various points at which you can engage with multiple governments, multiple entities. On Ukraine, you've got NATO, you've got the Ukrainians. How do you pick who you sort of talk to, where you come up with your sort of single point of truth, and where you come up with your single point of action? General.
Well, I think it starts from the point I was making at the back end of my comments about leadership. And I think that my advice to strategic leaders would be that the first thing they need to do is work out what they're trying to achieve. They need to have a plan. And if you've got a plan and you know what you're trying to achieve, then it follows logically who you want to engage with in order to get your narrative out there. And to give you an example, when I took over as Chief of the Defence Staff, within, I think, 8 days of becoming CDS, I was sitting in front of Theresa May and Philip Hammond, arguing for a bung to keep us going for the next year in the defence budget. And I remember thinking at the time, blimey, if I don't, as CDS over the next 3 years, find a way of landing a narrative which can get the money that defence needs, we'll be in a really, really bad place. So for the next 3 years, I focused entirely on how it was I was going to achieve that outcome. And that meant I was very careful who I spoke to. I knew exactly what message I was trying to get out there. And I also made a lot of effort to get others inside the chain of command to understand the argument. And that led to a number of concepts being written. It led to a number of interviews. It led to a number of speeches. And it led to a full panoply of, if you like, engagements. So I think it starts with knowing what you're trying to achieve. And then I think you're then able to stand back, put the noise of the daily 24-hour news cycle to one side, and keep focusing what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Interesting. Manveen, I mean, from a journalist, there are essentially 2 ways of approaching this problem, right? The first is the same one that General Nick has outlined. You have a goal, you want to achieve it, and your journalism follows that goal. So you might be a journalist who is single-mindedly dedicated to getting Britain out of the European Union, and all your reporting will follow that. Or you might decide that you want to follow where the story is. Can you just talk through your kind of decision-making process on that front?
Yeah, I think it's very hard as a journalist to start off with an aim. I was bred in the BBC, effectively, where impartiality is such a core part of the way you're taught to do journalism that you can't start off thinking you know the answer. Otherwise, your journalism is completely flawed. You've got to start off with a question, really, and then head off and try and find the best answer you can. And I think I think it's really interesting what you sort of said about that sort of daily news, constant churn. I think that really is the biggest problem at the moment, is working out how you cut through that. And that's why I ended up focusing on investigations. And I think it's really interesting at the moment watching the coverage of Ukraine, because as a journalist, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. You know, I mean, I sort of lived through media coverage of Iraq and Afghanistan, and even though those were wars that Britain was engaged in, there was enough cynicism about them here that meant that the journalism was always questioning. You're right, some of the embeds were a little bit uncomfortable. People, I think, sort of became a little too close to the people they were covering sometimes. But generally, there were still difficult questions being asked. Ukraine, however much you feel for what they're going through, is a very weird moment where a lot of the coverage, a lot of the reports you see, people are very open about being cheerleaders for the Ukrainian cause in a way that I, you know, as a journalist, is very, very difficult. And it does mean that people aren't calling out, you know, war crimes that are being carried out by the Ukrainians as much. I mean, we're not getting a huge amount of access. We're only, you know, we only get told how many Russians they think they've killed, which often, you know, when you see the British figures come out, they're often sort of radically less. But, you know, nobody's telling us about how many Ukrainians are being killed. And it does feel like the journalism covering Ukraine at the moment isn't asking enough of the tough questions. I mean, I hope that that'll change. It's difficult because you can sort of see that relationship between the journalism and how it's being reported and the support it's getting in this country, and therefore the politics around the weapons that are being supplied. But as a journalist, you can't be part of the propaganda campaign to allow that to happen. You've still got to be asking the difficult questions, and I worry that that isn't happening enough.
Perfect. Deborah, have we got some online questions, or do you want me to take some from the room? So, fantastic. You know, if I can raise a hand if you have questions, and I will come take them probably in groups of a couple. Yourself, sir, in the front row. Yeah. Yeah, that's you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. David Omand, former Permanent Secretary. Is one of the implications of those excellent talks that we've got to be less defensive and secretive when occasionally things don't work out according to plan? There's a row going on at the moment with investigative journalists challenging the Ministry of Defence's claim that no innocent civilians at all were killed during the operations against ISIS. I've no idea if that's true or not, but it invites the challenge. Why aren't we much more on the front foot, saying our operations are necessary, they're proportionate, they don't always achieve the results. When they don't, we accept responsibility and we stop getting into the defensive crouch whenever there's a suspicion that something hasn't quite worked out.
I'm going to take another couple. Not that diluting a David Omand question is necessary in any shape or form, but yourself, madam. Yep.
My name's Jean Seaton. I was worried in both of those talks by the lack of a proper institutional architecture for managing real information in a democracy. And not because I'm opposed to the army, or not because I thought they were both fantastic stories, but I am also a historian. And during the Second World War, there was a very much hated institution called the Ministry of Information, the subject of many hilarious novels, but it had real vision, because it was a place where what indeed Sir David was talking about, the interests of the strategic interests of us during a national war for survival, which I sort of think we're in now, and the interests of what information should be passed to whom and where, was actually negotiated in a really proper, though no doubt flawed way. And what worried me about this conversation was that I think that we really do need to take the structure of information, let alone before AI really blows everything out of the water. We need to really be serious about institutional structures. And I didn't hear, I'm sorry to say, anything about how in a democracy we would start to face up to that challenge. What would your answer be?
Yourself in the front row, and then
Ukraine and the global south, as evidenced by the vote in the General Assembly. What, if anything, can we do to counter this in cooperation with Ukraine?
Perfect. So I think some really good questions there, particularly institutional architecture. Should we sort of sometimes be a bit more on the front foot? And on Ukraine and the global south, I think one of the things that I'm really struck by is how powerful the iconography has been in Ukraine. One green T-shirt goes a very long way from President Zelensky in terms of sort of pulling together sort of one common narrative. General, do you want to take the first two questions?
No, sure. And they are, as you observe, very connected. And yes, I do rather agree with your point of view about some form of institutional architecture. And of course, when one sat around the National Security Council table in my former job, there were often times when one wondered whether the Director of Government Communications could perhaps play this role. But of course, the difficulty we all have in this, don't we, is that in seeking to protect the very values that we live by, we must make sure we don't undermine those values. And I think that successive administrations would be concerned if they went down a path where they could be accused of messaging in a fashion that might easily be linked to their own political agenda. And I think the conversation we need to bring on is how we preserve and protect democracy more broadly. And I think that then would give you a clue as to where you go with the story and the narrative and everything associated with it. And I remember when I first created 77 Brigade being given quite a hard time by the Ministry of Defence, that here was I trying to perhaps create an organisation that might be able to help the Army's narrative resonate at a high level. And that was absolutely not what it was intended to do. It was for the battlefield, and it was a tactical instrument that was necessary to achieve all of that. These are very contentious issues, but I do agree with you. I think we should bring on a debate about how it is that we're going to avoid misinformation and disinformation, and how it is that we're going to make sure that a narrative that is a truthful and positive narrative does resonate. And that, of course, plays into the question about the Global South. And, having travelled a bit since I was the Chief of the Defence Staff and having gone to countries in the Global South, it is very striking that not many of them would differentiate between what we did in Iraq in 2003 and what Mr. Putin is, of course, doing in Ukraine 20 years later. And the difficulty we've got, I think, is that when I was growing up, America was that golden city on the hill. And America was the democracy that we all espouse to be part of and understand. And of course, we remember wonderful oratory from people like President Kennedy when he talked about America's duty being the watchmen on the walls of world freedom and all that good stuff. Of course, what's happened since 9/11 is we've lost that story. And that is the challenge we've got. We're not going to fix this overnight. If we're going to get our narrative to land in the Global South, it's got to be a genuinely strategic attempt. And it's got to be done in a way that might resonate with those. And it means, if you like, walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And it's not going to be fixed overnight. And David, I very much agree with your point of view. I've always believed that one's far better off being honest and transparent. And the difficulty, I think, to a point that Manveen made in her talk, is the problem we've got is that our institutions are being politicised. And you see that in the appointing process, you see that in the way that political leaders want to play with them. And the bottom line is, our institutions are the backbone of our democracy. And those institutions need to be able to speak honestly about what is happening. It mustn't be politicised. And all of us, as citizens of this country, have a duty to hold our governments to account, to make sure that actually we're allowed to keep institutions that are genuinely free and able to speak what they want to say, albeit without politicising the message. But I do think we need to be able to do that. And I do think we need to go back slightly to your point and think a bit more about British soft power. And I'm sure people in this room are well enough informed to know that the decision was taken by the BBC about 8 weeks ago to get rid of the BBC Arabic service, a service that's been around for 85 years and touches 8 million listeners, all for the saving of £28 million a year. Well, who is sitting down and realising that this country has some great soft power? And it's that soft power which will answer the question you raised about the Global South. And we lose it at our peril. And we're in the business of losing it at the moment, and it must change.
Yeah, and just to add as a right to that, Manveen, the one area in which the Russians have been remarkably successful in their terms of their RT and Sputnik platforms has been in the Arabic space. As a general rule of thumb, Russian disinformation often reaches, a couple of 100,000 people, a couple of million people on a good day. In the Middle East, it is reaching 10 times more that on a routine basis. And it's one of the areas where they've done very well. Manveen, any points on any of those questions?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think when you sort of hear statements like that from the MOD, it always reminds me of African governments who tell you that they won an election by 99.9%. It's just absurd. You're not going to engender trust, and it puts you in a very difficult position to call out other governments for not being entirely honest if you have just the aura of suspicion around you. In terms of the institution of the institutionalization of truth, effectively, of having a ministry of information almost. I think it's an attractive idea in terms of these disinformation campaigns you see coming out. It's terrifying because we don't have a coordinated response to them, and I think that is a real worry. I think there are difficulties in a liberal democracy, though, because who decides what is true? That's something we have a difficulty with all the time as journalists. We're constantly couching because it's very hard quite often to prove something isn't true, or to prove, all of that is very difficult. And in a way, I think the BBC in the past has been incredibly accurate at that. I think, as Nick pointed out, it's valued around the world as quite often the arbiter. I worked in the Middle East. I have never received so many messages from politicians and warlords in the last few weeks as I have in the last few weeks complaining about BBC Arabic being pulled, because that's where they'd go to find out what was really happening. Because not even they trust the channels that quite often they're funding because they know they're putting out propaganda. We've basically taken away a massive tool of soft power, but also what we were doing by putting out, we would often cover stories on the BBC that wouldn't be covered locally. We would be questioning things that were happening, which allowed the populations to do the same in a way that they weren't being taught to do by their own government. So I think that's a massive loss, and I think the BBC, also before it was politicised, before appointments seemed quite as political as they are now, was something that provided you with what could be seen as an accurate version of the truth. And now I think that's failing. I think there's a real sort of loss of trust in it, even in this country, which is a shame.
I'm going to add one point that I'd quite, on the cross-government thing. One of the things I'm really struck by General Nick's, when he was writing Army 2020, it was relatively easy for him to create 77 Brigade. And then became CGS and was able to action it. Do you want to just talk about how much harder it is to achieve that kind of thing in the cross-government space when there are fewer people with that level of authority?
Yes, I don't know. I do think, and we saw that during the government's response to COVID, I do think there are moments when you can get behind a narrative and you can get stuff done. But as David would know, as a former Permanent Under-Secretary, it's jolly difficult to get stuff done in Whitehall. And one of the reasons why the Ministry of Defence is often required to get stuff done is because it actually has an action arm called the Armed Forces. It's a Department of State and a higher headquarters. And there are not many government departments that are able to do that. So I think it's more complex than that. But I do think that when there is a national need, in my experience, people tend to have got behind making something happen.
Or never let a good crisis go to waste. Going to take another couple of questions. James.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Oxford Media Centre and Global Strategy Forum for getting us all together and two riveting presentations. I'm James Kidner, formerly of the Foreign Office and then of the more foreign world of technology. My question, though, is about leadership, and it's more a question for Sir Nick. If you are seeking to empower your soldiers with certainty and confidence ahead of a battle, and you've got Manveen and her tribe interested in the broader perspective, and you are trying to sort of tease out energy and the conviction that drives it, how do you manage that process when you've got Lead A breathing down your neck and you've got the Daily Mirror chasing you and all your soldiers are mired in uncertainty and lack of confidence?
Really good question. Someone else had a hand, front row and then the...
Hi, I'm John Everard. I'm a former diplomat. Because I committed absolutely appalling sins in a previous life, I am condemned to listening to a lot of Russian radio. And Viesti, the central Russian station, 4 days ago, carried an interview with one of the members of the Foreign Ministry who was saying how difficult it's getting to get the Russian truth across in Africa. More and more difficult, he said, as the imperialists continue their lies and their propaganda, pushing back against the news, the truth that we bring the African people, who are starting to think, he said, that we are only saying this because we despise them. Are you getting any of that?
That's interesting. I mean, I think the Russians do think that they're having a bad time in the global south. Madam there. And then...
Thank you. This is a question for General Nick, who I know of old. So it's good to see you again, Nick. It's more practical. Let me stand up. It's a more practical issue. It's about what you said about 77 Brigade, and also you're quite alarming to me statistics about the drop in number of words that people use from Shakespeare's time to see it reduced to now is really, truly frightening. So I was wondering in relation to that, how do you think that neurodiverse people fit into that? Which is absolutely not to say they have less vocabulary, not at all. But you and I both know that they have different skill sets. We know about that with regards to in cyber. So I was just wondering how, with regards to the media, both social and mainstream, how do you think that has helped?
Perfect. I might go to Manveen and then maybe General Nick, and I know we are pushing a 2 o'clock finish. What time is it now?
1 minute 2.
Fantastic. In that case, I will let Manveen very fast answer those questions and then General Nick to finish off.
On the Global South point, I think they still have much better networks in pumping their message out. They're not always being met with a great response at the moment in Africa in particular, because I think a lot of people in Africa see Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine as a colonial move. And that's why it's not having the resonance it did. Also, I think people forget that in Africa there's a huge infrastructure that the Russians have had in place ever since, the spread of communism and when they were sort of helping freedom fighters back in the day. And a lot of that is being challenged at the moment. So that's partly why they're sending Wagner into certain places in order to shore it up. So for them, Africa is where the great battleground is at the moment. And I think they're worried that with all their attention on Ukraine, it's not going as well as it should.
General.
Yeah, just to pick up on the first question. I mean, I think we do genuinely believe in delegating and decentralising, right down to levels well below what we call unit levels, so groups of 600 people or more. And in so doing, I think our expectation would be that their exposure to journalism is probably only 1 or 2 journalists they might see on a daily basis. But I think what we also believe in is in providing our soldiers, and for that matter sailors and airmen and women, with a very good understanding of the bigger picture these days. Because of course if you do want to decentralise and delegate, what you've got to do is to make sure that the context is properly explained, because otherwise they won't seize the opportunities that might come in fleeting terms on a complex battlefield. So I think they're much more savvy than we might know. I also think that they tend to often be our best adverts, far better than me, who's less likely to believe. They'll be believed. And I think that we have always been comfortable, therefore, with the truth being told at that level, perhaps rather more than, as Dave was observing, at the higher level. And I think we trust them to tell that story. And I think that mutual trust is fundamental to our ethos and the way that we prevail in combat operations. Yes, as I said in my remarks, we'll get let down from time to time with the younger generation's predilection with uploading rubbish onto the internet. But in basic terms, I think we trust them. We make sure they understand the bigger picture and they understand what we're trying to achieve. And we don't feel that they should be stopped from explaining that to people who come to ask them about it. So I think that's probably how we do it. And very quickly, in answer to the last question, very important. And you know me well enough to know that one of the things I espoused, both as head of the army, but particularly as the chief of the defence staff, was we need to be in the business of maximising everybody's talent and giving people the opportunity to communicate and understand things through whatever media is most appropriate for them. Surely has to be the way ahead.
Fantastic. I think that's been an excellent discussion from 2 fantastic speakers. Deborah, is there anything else you'd like to say?
I just wanted to thank Global Strategy for collaborating on this project. Thank Jacqueline Jinks in particular, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. Do look at their website, they're doing amazing stuff, and thank you for coming.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.